Thor. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 1 in the Heart of Ice series. Written by Demelza Carlton. 1. When he spotted the plane at the end of the pass, Thor couldn't help but grin. He quickened his step, eager to finally meet Jarl Eric's men in battle. This was what they'd trained for. Planned for. Yearned for, since the day they'd returned home from a raid only to find Eric's handiwork. No one left alive and the village still smoldering. And what Eric and his men had done to his sister, Sif. Even now, he had trouble banishing the image from his head. She'd looked like she'd been mauled by a beast. Deep gashes that slashed from her face down the chest of the tunic Thor had recognized as one of his own, slicing flesh and fabric, so that she would have bled out from her wounds quickly, had they not killed her outright. And clutched in her hands, those cold, stiffened fingers not relinquishing their hold even in death, their father's hammer. Sif had fought with her last breath, Thor did not doubt, and was likely in Valhalla with all the other warriors right now, but she deserved more. She deserved justice. Thor's thirst for vengeance had smoldered ever since. Finally, he could unleash the full fury of its flame on Eric and his men, who had taken everything from him. But even the crunch of his boots on the snow could not drown out the worried whispers of those who followed him. One of the scouts didn't come back. They could be waiting for us. Ready to ambush us. What if? Indeed, what if? Thor lifted his hammer high into the air. What if, when we leave the pass, we come charging out of the snow and straight into battle? Oh, the glory of it! To fight and die in battle, to be reunited in Valhalla with those who died in Eric's cowardly attack on our village? Or to be victorious, and send Eric to hell with all the other cowards? He shook his hammer. Onward to glory! Onward, came Odin's shout from higher up the pass. As well he might. He'd lost his wife and sons in the raid, he had more reason for vengeance than all the rest of them put together. To victory! The other men picked up the cry until it became one wordless shout that carried them all forward, boots no longer crunching but pounding, like the beat of 100 drums, first at Thor's back and then on his flanks, as eager to enter battle as Thor himself. If Eric didn't know they were coming, he knew now. Thor hoped the man quaked in his boots. For Odin and glory, Thor swore as he raced out onto the plain. And straight into the battle he'd prayed for. He swung his hammer until it dripped with blood, and still the battle raged. For every man he felled, 2 more seemed to spring up in his place. Like some sort of sorcery. For Odin and glory, he roared again, and he heard the answering call from far fewer men than before. He fought on with renewed vigor, for those who were already waiting in Valhalla. Afternoon faded into twilight, and still he fought on. Another and another, and another. Then Eric's men seemed to pause, as though they'd heard a command he had not. Had Eric ordered them to surrender or retreat, like the coward he was? Elation welled up in Thor's chest. For Odin, he shouted, rushing forward into the fray. He was forced to halt, as Tyr and one of Eric's men blocked his way. Eric's man fell, and Tyr lifted his axe to deliver a killing blow, only for the most enormous wolf Thor had ever seen to fasten its jaws around Tyr's hand. The axe dropped to the ground. The creature reared up, extending its claws, and raked them down Tyr's front, before dragging them free from the dead man's flesh, to unleash a fountain of blood. Tyr collapsed, sightless eyes staring up at the Valkyries, no doubt coming to collect his soul to take to Valhalla, as the slashes on his face and chest wept his lifeblood into the snow. Just like Sif. For Sif, Thor roared, charging the creature. Was it a wolf or a man? Or some unholy union of both? The creature rose up from 4 legs onto 2, so that it stood taller than even Thor, and grinned. It was a wolfish grin, but the expression in its eyes was definitely human. Whatever this thing was, it was an abomination. A monster that deserved to die. For Sif and Tyr and no doubt countless others it had slain. Thor swung his hammer. But darkness enveloped him, before he could land a blow on the beast. 2. Ah, you must be the other Harold Medal winner. Sybil spun around, feeling dangerously like a turtle about to tip over, with her heavy pack still strapped to her back, until she sighted the woman who'd spoken and managed to steady herself against the wall. She looked like she belonged here, all tall and blonde with broad shoulders that would have no problem with Sybil's pack. Sybil wished her pack was a shell, so she could crawl inside and hide. She was definitely small enough to fit. Not like this Viking shield maiden. Not for the first time, Sybil wished one of her cousins were here. Or all of them. Tacy, who got along with everybody. Callie, who cursed everybody. Sometimes literally, even as she swore magic didn't exist. Octavia, who was Batman for computers, while seeming to know every illegitimate businessperson in the Southern Hemisphere. Or even Alethea, who was too damn nice for her own good. But none of them had won the Harold Medal, so all her cousins were back home in Western Australia, while she was on the other side of the world, almost in the Arctic Circle no less, about to go on the archaeological dig of a lifetime. 3 months ahead of schedule, thanks to global warming. The Harold Medal was only awarded once every 5 years, and last time, they hadn't found a suitable candidate. So the odds of 2 medalists in the same place at the same time were practically astronomical, if not downright impossible. The Viking woman grinned, like she was reading Sybil's mind. I know, right? I mean, last time they didn't pick anyone at all, so this time, having 2 winners is just weird. I did a bit of digging. It turns out the old guy whose company sponsors the medal, and his name isn't Harold, by the way, which surprised me, was in hospital 5 years ago, when the medal wasn't awarded, and he left the selection process up to his company board. They decided the financial outlay was more than they could afford, so to cut costs, they simply announced they didn't have anyone suitable. Fast forward 5 years. Harold has happily recovered from heart surgery, and is fired the board for making a mess of his company. To make up for the mess they made of the medal, this year he decided to have 2 winners. You and me. She pressed a hand to her chest, then held it out for Sybil to shake. I'm Jerun, by the way. I do reindeer. Sybil shook her hand, but now she was even more confused. I'm Sybil and wait, you do what? She couldn't possibly do reindeer. Who said they were into bestiality when meeting someone for the first time? Jerun laughed. Reindeer. Historic human-reindeer interactions, both hunting and domestication. At least, that's what I'm hoping to do my PhD project on, if we find enough evidence in the Jotunheimen Mountains this dig. Don't worry, I won't tread on your toes. You do Vikings, don't you? Sybil felt her cheeks grow hot. She'd never done a Viking, or any man who looked like one. Sure, she might have a type, and Chris Hemsworth might tick all the boxes for it, but she'd never. Jerun didn't seem to be the least bit embarrassed. Have you already sampled the local man candy? I swear, Norway is like Hemsworth heaven. I mean, sure, you can't check out the goods like on the beach back home, but Vikings sure are alive and well here. I wouldn't mind one myself, even if it's only for one night. She blinked. Oh, but you're hoping for a dead one, aren't you? I thought that was what your project summary said. Sybil cleared her throat and found her voice. I'm hoping for evidence of a battle mentioned on a runestone found in a Viking grave a few years ago. The whole thing is pretty vague, and some scholars suggest it's referring to a myth about Thor and Loki in Utgard that never actually happened, but it also mentions a mountain pass that was also thought to be mythical, until one really warm summer revealed a whole bunch of artifacts right where the pass was supposed to be. My supervisor thinks that if there really is a 2,000-year-old pass through this part of the Jotunheimen Mountains, and it's pretty clear from the surveys already done at the site, that it was a rather busy highway in its time, it's possible this battle and the nearby village they were fighting over might have actually existed, too. Yep, dead Vikings. I'm not sure who's crazier, you or Carl, because you both want to find corpses. I don't need to find corpses. Just evidence of the battle. Or the village. After a battle there are bodies, unless they burned them all, which surely they wouldn't have done to everyone, because the early Vikings believed that was a sign of honor, sending the slain to Valhalla, which they wouldn't have wanted for the losers, who they probably would have dumped in a mass grave, or at the feet of their own slain warriors. Even a village would have graves. Or some sign of the settlement. Weapons, foundations, midden heaps, something. Sybil blew out a breath. Sorry. I know the chances of finding anything are slim, and I'll probably have to rework my entire project to encompass whatever we do or don't find, but it all just fits so well. Like something's out there, waiting to be found. Sybil ducked her head. Great. Now Jaran probably thought she was an idiot. Or a conspiracy theorist. At least Sybil hadn't mentioned the crazy theories involving aliens that the Marvel movies had only reinforced. Sounds like we'll be fighting over the arrowheads, if we find any. Jaran didn't look pleased. Oh no, of course not. Early Vikings rarely used bows and arrows in combat, except when they were defending the shore against raiders arriving by boat. I know sea levels have changed a lot over the years, but not at this altitude. Hunting, however. She paused to think for a moment. Really? Reindeer? I mean, I guess it's really just venison, but if any of the kids back home who still believe in Santa Claus knew people ate Rudolph. Jaran grinned. All the more reason for us to write research papers for peer-reviewed journals, and not children's books. With luck, we'll both get enough out of this survey to write a thesis on, and before we know it, we'll be picking our postdoctoral projects. Amen to that. Jaran dropped her voice to a whisper. Anything's better than being stuck with PhD students. Worse than rats? The sneering man who'd said it didn't look much older than they were. Early 30s at most. I hope you two FIFL don't expect special treatment. You'll be carrying your own gear, and don't expect a tent to yourself either. Jaran glared at him. Who are you calling an idiot, idiot? You interrupted us discussing who gets which side of the tent. Right, Rumi? Jaran linked her arm through Sybil's. Sybil barely knew either of them, but she already knew who she'd prefer to share a tent with, so she just nodded and tried to look like none of this was news to her. Heaven knew she could do with a friend out here, with her family all back on the other side of the world. He muttered something that didn't sound particularly nice, as he stormed back out again. And that was? Sybil prompted. Dr. Nikolai Fridolfsson, newly minted PhD. He'll try to get you to call him Dr. Fridolfsson, because he thinks is the God's gift to the world. Most people call him Nick, or Saint Nick, because he thinks the sun shines out of his ass. He's also the reason we have to share a tent, because there were enough until he joined the expedition. She stuck her tongue out at the door he'd departed through. Of course, no one wants to share with him. He'll probably whine the whole time about how much better archaeology is in Egypt. Sybil couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. Wasn't it every archaeologist's dream, to do a dig in Egypt? Is that where he did his PhD? Jaran laughed. Nope. He did his on a 1700-year-old shirt, found at the same site we're headed to. He was accepted for a postdoc in Egypt, but with all flights cancelled due to the pandemic, he never made it out there in time to join the survey team. They've been really lucky too. They haven't made any of their findings public yet, but you wait. Once it hits the news, everyone will know about it. Keep an eye out for Sakara. How do you know all this stuff? Sybil asked. Duran shrugged. People talk. I listen. Besides, I had to catch a lift here with the rest of the team, and after 15 minutes in a car with Nick, you'd wish he had gone to Egypt and opened a cursed tomb so he never made it back too. Sybil couldn't condemn him as easily as Duran did. Yeah, but if I'd missed out on a paid research trip to Egypt because of the pandemic, I'd be pretty bitter about it too. Anyone would. You've got to feel sorry for the guy. Duran nodded slowly. For the first 10 minutes after you hear about it, before you meet him, maybe. Or maybe the first 5 minutes after you meet him. By the end of this week, you'll agree with me, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. She picked up her pack, which looked bigger than Sybil's. Come on, let's see if Lara needs any help loading up the supplies. According to Carl, there's always one bottle of aquavit too many to fit on the pack horses, and if you're there at the right time, with space in your pack, we'll have that bottle to toast our first night at site as roommates. What do you think? But before Sybil could think, let alone reply, Duran led the way outside to where the pack horses waited. Yes, actual pack horses, the only way up into the mountains to the dig site, aside from their own 2 feet. One thing was for certain, this was going to be an interesting trip. 3. Thor woke with a pounding head, and a mouthful of swearing he couldn't spit out fast enough. What was that thing? I'll thank you to keep a civil tongue in your head, or I will no longer heal you. Then we'll see how long a man can live with a wound such as yours. Thor's eyes flew open. Pain still lanced through his skull, but in the dimness, he could make out a feminine silhouette that was likely the source of the tart voice. Are you a witch? He croaked. For surely only a woman with magic could heal him. He'd heard tales of witches who could work miracles and ones who could make a man's life a misery. Which one this woman was, he had yet to discover, but if she meant to heal him, he held on to hope that she might be the benevolent kind, for there was not much he could do if she meant him harm. His head had not hurt this much even after that night he'd challenged Loki to a drinking contest, and drunk an entire barrel full of mead. He'd won the contest, but the next morning he had not felt like a victor. This time there had been no mead. Only a giant grinning wolfman, with paws the size of his aching head. What was that thing? He asked. The witch, if that was what she was, pressed a hand to his forehead. Hush. Healing requires focus, lest I knit your hair together instead of your wound, and I give you a hat you can never take off. Definitely a witch, though a young one by the sound of her voice. And comely, from what little he could see of her in the faint light. I am a mighty warrior. Many women have wanted me for their husband. If you heal me and bring me back to fighting strength, I could make you the envy of all other women, and take you for my own, Thor offered. Mighty indeed. I've seen you fight. But you are still no match for Fenrir, so if you do not wish me to call on him to give you another blow to the head, you will hush and let me do my work. Father wants you well, but if I need to call for help to hold you down to heal you, he may decide you're more trouble than you're worth, and let Fenrir finish what he started. Thor began to laugh. That thing has a name? Fenrir. She set her hands on her hips. He is as much a man as you, maybe more so, for he bested you in battle. If you are lucky, you may fight at his side next time. That is Father's wish anyway. But it did not sound as if it was hers. And what is your wish? Thor ventured. For if he could get her on his side, maybe. I wish men would not sneak up on settlements in the night to attack one another, so that we must fight to defend what is ours. I wish men could be content with what they have, instead of reaching for what is not theirs, wanting more. I wish you would shut your mouth so I can finish healing you and send you to the feast with Father like he wants, so that you will be his problem and not mine." Her hand pressed him down against the bed, and he yielded to her, for he suspected her patience was growing thin, and he did want her to heal him if it was within her power. He was a fighter, and even he knew he could not fight while his head hurt. Finally she was done, dusting her hands off as if washing them of her responsibility for him. A pity, for she was pretty, even if she was a witch. Perhaps if not for that creature's attack, he would not be wounded, and she would have admired him as the warrior he was. Women did flock to him, whether he willed it or no. Just not this witch. Thor sighed. Probably for the best. Comely or not, she had a sharp tongue and he did not fancy her for a wife. "Fenrir is ready to go see father," the girl called. Thor braced himself for another attack from the beast, but instead he saw a man. A man much like himself, with the tall broad stance of a warrior. This man, Thor knew he could best in a fight. Then the man grinned, a wolfish smile that Thor feared would haunt his dreams for many years to come. For man or beast, this was the same creature he'd fought. Sif's killer. "Come on, little man. Thank Miss Astrid for her kindness in healing you instead of cutting out your heart, as you deserve." He held out his hand, yes, definitely a hand, and not a paw, to help Thor up. It rankled to be reminded of his courtesies by this creature, so Thor ignored the hand and rose to his feet unaided. He might not like the witch's killer companion, but Thor was grateful to the girl. Especially now he could stand, with his head no longer hurting. A miracle indeed. He bowed to her. "My thanks to you, Miss Astrid. If you ever have need of my hammer, you have only to say the word, and I shall defend you." He glanced around, but there was no sign of his hammer anywhere in the small cottage. Fenrir saw him looking and laughed. "A pretty pledge, though hardly necessary. You and your hammer are the property of Jarl Erik now. King Erik if he has his way. And he will if none are strong enough to stand against him." A look passed between Fenrir and Astrid, before she ducked her head and looked away. "Come, little man. If you make a good impression on Erik at the feast, he may even give you your hammer back." Thor followed Fenrir out of the cottage. "Fenrir." Fenrir halted. "Yes, Miss Astrid?" His entire stance was expectant, hopeful. What did a creature like him hope for? "Don't hurt him. I'd hate to have to heal him all over again. It was hard enough work the first time." Disappointment flickered over Fenrir's face for only a moment, and then it was gone. "As you wish, Miss Astrid. Your wish is my command, of course." There was no mockery in his words. Thor wondered if his subservience was because the girl was a witch, or because she was Jarl Erik's daughter. Curious that she had not issued the same command to Thor as she had to Fenrir. Did the girl mean to make it easier for Thor to have his vengeance for Sif's murder, in forbidding Fenrir to fight back? For the moment Thor had his hammer back, the wolf-man's life was forfeit. This Thor swore. "Whatever you think you know, you are wrong, little man," Fenrir said softly as they moved away from the cottage. "Forget Miss Astrid, for you have taken up enough of her time. If you so much as look at her again, I will kill you, no matter what her father says. Jarl Erik may rule Utgard and all of these lands, but it is Miss Astrid I am sworn to serve, which I will do to my last breath. Which will come long after yours, I promise you." Fenrir flashed a grin, and for a moment, Thor thought there were more fangs than teeth in the man's mouth. A wolfish smile indeed. So Jarl Erik commanded a witch and a wolf. That explained the sorcery on the battlefield, as well as this beast. If the man was so powerful, could anyone stand against him? It was Thor's turn to grin. He'd never been one to back down from a battle, even if he was the last man standing from the raiding party that had come through the pass. The moment Eric gave him his hammer back, Thor would show both Eric and Fenrir what a true warrior was. 4. You know, you really should try the porridge one day. A hot breakfast does wonders for you when you're working in the snow all day, Lara said, ladling out a bowl for Duran. The site manager reminded Sybil of Tacy, the way she took care of everyone, or tried to. Sybil scrunched up her nose. No thanks. I lived with my cousin when she was introducing her baby girl to solids, and we spent months pretending to like all kinds of mush so she'd eat it. I like my cornflakes with plenty of crunch, even if it's with powdered milk. I have my coffee. That's hot enough for me. She held up her cup in a toast to morning caffeine, the miracle drug that got everyone going, even when it was -10 outside, like today. Duran laughed so hard she almost snorted her porridge. Sounds like enough to put you off having kids for life. Is that why you're here, doing your PhD a world away from there? To escape your family, like me. Homesickness smote Sybil hard. No. I love my family, and my cousins. Even Rory, who's 5 now and at school. I'm here because she'd always had her family around. Mum or her cousins. Out here without them, she had to do stuff for herself. Make her mark, a mark that was hers alone. Because I want to do something that's just me, alone. Duran grinned as she reached for an apple. So you joined an expedition with a whole team of us, so you can't possibly do anything alone? She dropped her voice into a pretty good approximation of Carl, the expedition leader. Safety first, never go alone. Even Lara laughed at that. He's right though. Never leave camp alone. There are wolves and bears in these mountains, and you don't want to meet a wolverine either. Unless it's Hugh Jackman. That man could share my tent anytime. If we're talking Aussie actors, I'd prefer a Hemsworth over Hugh. Right, Sybil? Duran asked. She tossed her empty porridge bowl in the washing-up tub, and bit into her apple. Sybil felt her cheeks grow hot. I came all the way over here for a real Viking, not some Aussie bloke pretending to be one. Duran laughed again. Oh, that's right. But if you do find a Viking body in the ice, you are not bringing him into our tent. Even if he is hotter than a Hemsworth, I draw the line at necromancy. Sybil choked on her cornflakes. Don't you mean necrophilia? Necromancy is raising the dead. Necrophilia is sleeping with them. No to either of them, especially in our tent. Then again, if you raised him from the dead, he's not really dead, and if he's still hot, would it really be necrophilia? Theoretically. Sybil smacked her arm. Now who's considering sleeping with a corpse? We'd have to find one first, and even Carl thinks that's unlikely. But he still brought the body bag, just in case. Duran tossed her apple core in the bin, and headed back to the washing-up tub to do her dishes. Everybody wants to be the one to find the Holy Grail. Don't tell me you don't want to find one of Hemsworth's ancestors under the ice. Nick stormed into the mess tent, and slammed his mug down next to the pot of hot water. What is wrong with you Australian girls? Always you are wanting to find that actor man here, when you will not find anything at all, unless you keep your mind on your work. This is not the place to find bodies. For proper human remains to study, you must go to Egypt, where even the ancients knew how to preserve a body properly, instead of by accident like these primitive Vikings. He let out a string of words that sounded like swaying, before stomping out of the tent, slopping coffee over his boots and swaying some more. Sybil turned to find Jerun's eyes on her. "Are you still feeling sorry for him?" Jerun asked. "We had a pool in the office, to see how long it would take before one of his colleagues in Egypt shut him in a pyramid or something," Lara said. We all wish he'd gone." Sybil sighed. She rarely wished ill of people, but after a week of working with Saint Nick, she had to admit, "If I was working on the same dig in Egypt as him, and I knew about your pool, I would have volunteered to do it, even if he only stayed stuck in there for an hour or so." Only an hour or so? 1,000 years is too good for him. Imagine archaeologists 1,000 years from now, finding him and thinking he's a tomb robber. Jerun said. 15 minutes until we start the survey, girls, so what's on the cards for today? To win your chance of no dishes at dinner time. Lara paused for effect. What do you bet we'll find? Arrows, Jerun said promptly, like she did every day. She'd already won twice this week. Sybil thought for a moment. Every other day she'd been wrong, so what was one more? A Viking sex god I can raise from the dead who can sleep in Nick's tent, and whack him with his axe every time he snores. Lara laughed so hard she spat out her coffee. Oh, I'd pay to see that. So would Sybil, she thought but didn't say. 5. The sense of smoke and roasted meat greeted Thor before he even entered the longhouse. He'd heard the shouts of merriment from inside, and dismissed them as normal eventide fare in any Viking camp. Only now did realization dawn on him that for Eric and his men, this was a victory feast. A victory over Odin's men. Thor's blood ran cold. He was no berserker, but as his rage built with every step toward the longhouse, he fancied he was fueled with enough fury to take down a dozen men, maybe more, the moment he held his hammer in his hands again. Or even just an axe. His gaze dropped to Fenrir's belt, only to see for the first time that the man carried no weapons at all. Like he was merely a lowly thrall instead of a mighty warrior, who'd bested Thor himself in a fight. Nothing about this wolfman made sense. Not that it needed to. He would be the first to die, as Sif's shade demanded. Fenrir entered the longhouse with Thor hot on his heels. Not a single head turned in their direction. There was no fanfare, and no one announced his arrival. Thor wasn't sure whether to be insulted by their disregard or relieved, for entering their victory feast as Eric's prisoner would surely have them jeering instead of cheering at him. But to be ignored completely was not something Thor was used to. Fenrir merely shrugged and pushed his way through the crowd, taking a seat in a dark corner far from the fire. Again like a thrall. But Thor did not intend to shrink away into the shadows. He'd come to confront Eric for his crimes against his people, and if Thor was the sole survivor of his village, then by all that was holy, he would do so, even if it cost him his life. Sif's shade demanded it. So he stood and waited. Waited while Eric's men crowded around the high table, hooting and cheering at what appeared to be a contest between two men over who could eat the fastest, or perhaps the most. Thor wasn't sure. Servants kept bringing more meat, bread and mead to the table as the two men consumed it all. More of Eric's beastly warriors, Thor told himself, curling his lip in disgust. At least the wolf had been a warrior. These two gluttons were more like wild boars or pigs the way they ate. Eric himself looked on from his chair, clapping his hands in approval as one of the men downed a horn of mead, before seizing a fresh joint of meat. The mead drinker bore a distinct resemblance to Eric, a son perhaps. The other man glanced up at Eric's son, then Eric himself, before grim determination wrinkled his brow as he too reached for more meat. Thor started in surprise. What was Loki doing, seated at Eric's high table? He'd been the best of Odin's scouts, the sneakiest snake who could find a way in and out of anywhere. Thor hadn't seen him during the battle, but that hadn't been surprising, for people rarely saw Loki until he'd already struck a blow, and by then it was too late. They'd been brothers in arms for as long as Thor could remember, and they were brothers still, if Loki had somehow survived the battle. Together, they would take on Eric and all his warriors. After Loki had won this contest, for surely Eric would not appreciate Loki embarrassing his son. Yet Loki was flagging, whilst the son's appetite seemed to grow. The world seemed to shift as Thor realized Loki was going to lose. Eric rose from his chair with a roar and declared his son the winner, amid cheers from the rest of his men. Loki, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his seat, shoulders hunched over as he drank down his disappointment with a mug of mead. "You hammer man!" Eric shouted, pointing at Thor. The hall fell silent, the crowd parting so that Thor could see not only Eric, but the table in front of him, where his hammer lay. "Your brother has accepted his place in my hall. How will you entertain us, and earn your place here, hammer man?" Eric demanded. Now all eyes turned to Thor. Thor considered correcting Eric. While he and Loki might look alike, they were not blood brothers. Indeed, Loki was usually the first to say something when someone made such a mistake. But after losing the contest, Loki seemed to want to avoid notice as much as possible, so Thor let Eric's words pass unchallenged. For he had a challenge of his own to issue. Thor looked Eric in the eye. "I would have my hammer back, Jarl Eric, and I challenge you to a drinking contest for it. He who can drink the most and stay standing will be the winner, before all these witnesses." He waved a hand at Eric's assembled warriors, who all held their breath. Evidently, it wasn't often that Eric himself was challenged beneath his own roof. But Eric either did not notice the insult, or did not care. He laughed. "A drinking contest we shall have. The first to the bottom of the barrel, who is still standing, then." Servants brought forth 2 barrels, which were broached before them. Eric's barrel was placed beside his chair, so that he might easily dip a mug into it without rising. Thor was not offered the courtesy of a seat, and he had to steal a rough wooden cup from a passing servant, instead of being offered a mug or drinking horn. No matter. When Thor had his hammer back, they would all pay for their poor hospitality. "For Odin," he whispered as he drained the first cup. Odin was no doubt in Valhalla with his family, as he deserved, and Thor would join him soon enough. A second cup chased the first, burning its way down Thor's gullet. A wiser man might have eaten something first, but Thor had no desire for food. No, all he wanted was vengeance for Sif. For Odin. And for all the rest of their village, murdered by these men. Thor lifted a third cup, as an offering to the gods, that they might grant him victory. That's when he saw his gesture mirrored by a man in a dark corner of the hall. A man with a leather patch over one eye, so Thor did not recognize him at first, but he blinked and he knew. Odin had survived the battle too, though he'd lost an eye doing so. He had no appetite either. All he held was a rough cup of wine, raised in anticipation of Thor's victory. A fourth cup, then a fifth. One after the other, Thor drank as if his life depended on it, for he suspected it did. Something clattered to Thor's right. Loki had dropped his mug, which rolled across the table and onto the floor. Empty, for he'd drunk it all and likely more besides, for Loki slumped to the table. A ruse, Thor was sure of it. Loki was never beaten. He must only be pretending to be overcome by the feast. When Thor reclaimed his hammer, Loki would leap up, alert as ever, to fight by his side. Thor lifted a sixth cup to his lips, and his eyes went to Odin. Odin slumped against the wall, almost sliding off the bench, as his cup slipped from his fingers. Thor dipped his cup into the barrel for the 7th time. Except, was it 1 cup or 2? Or perhaps 3. No. 1, 2, 3, 4. He'd never been so woozy before after drinking so little. Especially with Eric matching him drink for drink. "I will challenge any man here to beat me in a race," a reedy voice piped up. Thor blinked. It couldn't be. Was that Thialfi? How had the boy survived the battle? "No man is faster than me," Thialfi declared. "On a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. He bolted for the door. No one followed him. Thor allowed himself to smile. Thialfi might escape, and live a good long life. Thialfi made it to the doorway, before he appeared to trip over something and pitched forward. Thor expected him to catch himself, or at least rise and try to run again, but the boy stayed down. A man with a bow in one hand marched over to Thialfi and reached down. With one mighty yank, he brandished a bloodied arrow. An arrow bearing Thialfi's blood, Thor realized. Thialfi did not rise because the boy was dead. The bowman had been faster than the boy. Thor closed his eyes. All the more reason to beat Eric in this drinking contest. To win his hammer back and, un. Loki lay face down on the table. Odin had slid to the floor, where he was now snoring. And Eric lifted a horn of ale to his lips, curling them into a knowing smile. "The drink, you drugged it. You are an honorless wolverine, as much a beast as any of your so-called men. Give me back my weapon, and I shall take on all of you. Show you what a real warrior can do," Thor growled, reaching for his hammer. Or what he thought was his hammer, for there seemed to be half a dozen of the things lying on the table, but when his hand closed around what should have been the handle, he grasped only air. Then Thor hit the ground, so all he could see was the soot-blackened beams of the roof. Eric's face swam into view. "You couldn't best my own grandmother, or even her cat, in a fight. You don't belong in Valhalla, Hammerman." An old woman's face peered at him. And was that a cat? Thor had never seen a butter-colored cat before, yet there it was, looking down upon him as though he were the lowliest thrall to ever crawl out of a midden. "He drank 3 times as much as the others before he succumbed, Eric. This one's stronger than the rest. He will make a fine fighter in your army, just like I told you." Thor opened his mouth to tell her that he'd rather die than fight for the man who murdered his sister, but darkness swallowed him before he could get a word out. 6. "That's not how you record the GPS?" "But that's how I've always been taught. This is a real archaeology dig, not some student exercise in a 50-year-old rubbish dump. Actually, I did my honors on an 8,000-year-old site near the Burrup Peninsula back home. One of the first underwater Aboriginal sites ever investigated and—" "You call this documentation? Carl's 2-year-old granddaughter has better handwriting than this." Sybil peered at the page. "Actually, that's one of yours. You borrowed my blue pen when you forgot to bring anything of your own to write with, Nick. And you didn't give it back, either. That's Dr. Friedolfsson, girl." Sybil hadn't wanted to punch anyone so much in her life. Or knee him in the groin. She wished there had never been any pandemic, and Saint Nick had gone to Egypt like he'd planned, so he'd be someone else's problem. "You'll never get your PhD with substandard work like this. It's a wonder you even got your degree at all. Of course, pretty girls have an advantage. You must have slept with your professors. No other explanation." Tears of anger burned Sybil's eyes. Callie, her cousin, had been one of her teachers, and she'd said she'd never had a student who'd learned Norse runes faster than Sybil. Sybil had been invited up to the Burrup because they'd needed an extra person to process all the artifacts, and she'd been recommended for the job by no less than 2 of her unit coordinators. But Saint Nick wouldn't listen to a word of it. He'd probably accuse her of sleeping with them, too. She wished Callie were here to cast a curse on Nick. Something really horrible and creative, like having him catch some ancient disease that had melted out of the ice, which made his dick shrivel up and fall off. Or make him smell like a female reindeer in heat, so all the boy reindeer chased him around, trying to molest him. If you don't push him off a glacier before the season ends, I swear I will. Sybil glanced up, to find Jaran watching her with a sympathetic smile on her face. Maybe he's right, and I don't belong here. It's not like we've found anything even remotely connected to Utgard. Whereas you've found 2 hunting arrows already. Sybil began. 3. Found a 3rd one this morning, Jaran said smugly. 3 arrows in 2 weeks is a new record, Carl said. Sybil sighed. If the borders weren't closed, I'd give up and go home to Australia. I'm not cut out for this. Jaran's smile died. Don't talk like that. She slung an arm around Sybil's shoulder. We're the first ever dual Harold Medal winners. The only 2 in a decade. Hundreds of candidates entered, and they picked us. We're the best there is. Saint Nick never won a medal. He's just jealous, not to mention bitter, that it's our prize money that's funding this entire expedition. He wouldn't even be here if it weren't for us. We've only been out here 2 weeks. I bet your bugger-up dig didn't find anything in the first 2 weeks, either. We've got 3 arrows and a bunch of other stuff. Sybil managed a smile. Burrip, not bugger-up. And yeah, it took them 3 years of underwater survey work to find a site as rich as the one they finally did locate. Maybe we should push Saint Nick in the lake, and see if he finds anything interesting there. That didn't sound like a bad idea. Better than pushing him off a glacier, anyway. Then again, if he couldn't swim, he'd probably make us do his laundry while he sulks in his tent until his gear is dry. Or insist on borrowing our gear instead, Sybil said. Jaran looked glum. And he wouldn't wash it before he gave it back either. Imagine having to wear your gear after he'd sweated in it for days, unwashed. Just kill me now. Only if you do the same for me, Sybil quipped. God, it must be a bad day if she was making a death pact with her roommate before noon. Or, I could help you wish the dishes tonight after dinner, and when everyone's gone to bed, you could help me liberate a bottle of Lara's aquavit, and we could share it in the tent later. What do you say? Jaran asked. Sybil wanted to say yes, but you found an arrow today. That means you've won a night off doing the dishes. Plus, aren't those bottles all we have for the whole trip? What if Lara notices one missing? Jaran shrugged. They're for medicinal purposes. If she asks, I'll tell her Saint Nick was sapping our will to live, and nothing would restore it except some water of life. She'll understand. Besides, with the expedition budget higher than usual, we have a regular supply run. Jacob and his horses will be back in no time, and she can always order more for the next trip. It sounded like a plan, and a good one. With all of her family so far away, Sybil would be lost without Jaran. All right then, she said. Ah, the day's not even half over. Who knows? This afternoon, we might find one of Hemsworth's ancestors, complete with a hammer as big as he is, and he'll take one look at Saint Nick and pound him so deep into a glacier, no one will find him for 100 years. Sybil had to smile at that one. I think you're thinking of Captain America. He's the one who vanished beneath the Arctic ice and woke up much later. But he was a hot blonde dude, right? Sybil laughed. Yeah, he was that too. Jaran didn't seem fazed. Well, that's what they do with superhero movies, isn't it? They mash up all the stories into one movie, length one? So who says we won't find Thor holding his hammer, ready to jump to defend your reputation as an archaeologist? Maybe if we drink enough aquavit, he will. For a moment, anything seemed possible. Then a cloud slid in front of the sun, and the lake waters turned ashen gray again. Sybil sighed. All right. Dishes and drinks tonight, whether we find something amazing or nothing at all. Deal. Only if you promise not to talk about leaving again. You're the only one keeping me sane out here, Duran said. It's a deal, Sybil said. Right, back to work, Duran said, taking her place at Sybil's side, ready for another search pattern. Where they might find anything, Sybil told herself, as they began again. 7. Never drinking mead again, Thor swore to himself in time with the deafening drumbeat in his head. This had to be Loki's fault. He never drank this much without Loki goading him into it. Faint memories of Loki lying face down on a table drifted through his sore head. Which had to mean Thor had won again, hadn't he? Then why did his head pound so? Come to think of it, why was it so cold? No matter how much he'd had to drink, Thor would never be stupid enough to run naked in the snow. Yet it felt like a faint breeze tickled his bare chest, as he lay on something equally cold and hard, as glacier meltwater trickled through his veins. All that was nothing compared to the bite of a slab of ice landing on his chest, ice so cold it froze his heart solid. Thor opened his mouth to scream at the white-hot pain, but no sound came out. The sacrifice is complete. He is now a protector, who awaits my call. Thor knew that voice. It belonged to the witch girl. Which girl? What was her name? Miss Astrid, his sluggish thoughts reminded him, along with the name of the abomination that guarded her, Fenrir the Wolfman, murderer of Sif and countless others, under the command of Jarl Erik, who still lived and breathed. No. Thor had to end him. For Sif. He strained and struggled, but no matter what he did, he could not move. Protector Thor, what will you do when you hear my call? The witch asked. Thor's eyes flew open and he could see her. She was younger than he was. I will answer your call and fight at your command, mistress, Thor heard himself say, even as his head screamed at him not to. Will you protect me? She asked. I am yours to command, mistress, Thor said. A cold weight landed on his chest, before someone took his hand and laid it atop the icy metal. His hammer. If he could but grasp the handle and swing it, he could take out half a dozen of these men with one blow. More, maybe. But he could not move his hand from the head of the hammer, let alone grip the handle. It is done. Bury him, the witch instructed. Wait, what? Bury him? Thor wanted to scream, to struggle, to fight, but he couldn't move as men surrounded him and lifted him, then lowered him. Down, into a grave easily as deep as he was tall. Then the men stepped away, and for a moment Thor saw the dusky sky, before a shadow peered down. Fenrir, the abomination. Thor tried to roar out a challenge to the Wolfman, to grab the hammer and leap out of the grave they'd dug for him, to go down fighting, as was his right as a Viking warrior, but he could neither move nor make a sound. Sleep, protector, until you hear my call, the witch said. A shower of soil and snow came down on him, followed by a hail of stones, until Thor could no longer see any light. Then the water came, gushing down over the stones and soil and snow, soaking him. But it didn't stop there. The water level kept rising and rising, until it covered his face, and he could no longer draw breath. Screaming silently, he surrendered to the darkness once more. But not willingly. Never that. 8. Sybil wasn't sure what was worse, the hangover from drinking too much aquavit with Duran last night, or the porridge Lara had insisted she eat to combat the hangover, which now swirled in her stomach, threatening to come right back up again and splatter across the rocks. the rocks she was supposed to be surveying for artifacts. She rested a hand on the rock cairn she knew dated back over 1,000 years. It had been surveyed at length on an earlier dig. As long as she didn't knock it over, no one would mind if she took a quick break to get her stomach contents under control. She was never eating porridge ever again. Goldilocks could keep the foul gloop. Now her vision was playing tricks on her. The rocks in front of her looked lighter than the others, like someone had parked a car on them when it was raining, leaving the stone beneath bone dry, while the rest was damp and dark. Then another lighter patch, a couple of meters further along, and a third patch too. Very small cars though. Only a couple of meters long and barely a meter wide. More like someone had laid their swag tents on these 3 spots instead of cars. Which was crazy, because this whole area was loose rock on top of permafrost, and trying to sleep on a surface like that was more like something out of The Princess and the Pea, only the whole surface was peas, and the peas were fist-sized and sharp. She scuffed her boot at the nearest patch of pale rock, dislodging a couple, before a third came up with part of a broken sheet of ice. Like someone had poured water here and it had frozen in a sheet beneath the stones. Sybil kicked aside a few more rocks, revealing more and more of the ice sheet, until she'd revealed it all. Yes, the ice sheet was about as big as a swag, but it had melted in the warm weather, so it was thin enough to break when she tapped it with her marker sticks. Well, if she really wanted to see what lay under the ice. Sybil poked the bundle of sticks under the nearest edge of the ice sheet, slowly working it deeper underneath it, until it was about as far as it could go. Then she put her weight to the lever, pushing with all her strength to flip the sheet over. It took a couple of tries, especially as the sheet kept breaking, until she finally managed to shift that too. Only to find another layer of ice, which didn't shatter the way the first one had when she tapped it. In fact, it almost sounded like metal. Throwing the sticks aside, she raked her boot across the ice. Yep, that was metal all right. Almost as big as her boot, and glinting in the sun. She tried to dig around it with her gloved hands, but whatever it was stuck firmly in the ice. "Guys, I think I found something," she called to the rest of the team, who'd continued walking their transects without realizing she'd fallen behind. Nick said something Sybil was certain was a swear word in Norwegian. "Just put a flag in it, and keep moving. You're holding us up." He turned his back on her and kept going. The others didn't dismiss her so easily. "What is it?" Carl asked eagerly. "Something big and metal," Sybil shouted back. She saw his shoulders sag as if he was disappointed. Of course, it was no secret Carl wanted to find his own Iceman. But he planted his marker sticks in the spot where he'd ended his survey, and trudged back to where Sybil knelt. The rocks looked lighter than the ones around it, so I shifted a few and found an ice sheet underneath, so I moved that too, Sybil said, pointing. And under it was this. Carl dropped to his knees beside her and pulled out his canteen. He unscrewed the lid, then carefully poured the contents over the artifact and the surrounding ice. A wisp of steam rose up, then vanished. Sybil dared to look down again and gasped. Whatever it was had been intricately carved or forged in. "Gelling style," Carl breathed, in almost the same moment as Sybil thought it. "See the swirling and intertwining, with the heads in profile? You know how old this is?" "At least 1,000 years, Sybil said, barely believing it. "It looks like an axe, but something this ornate would never have been used as a weapon." "We'll have to dig it out of the ice to see," Carl said. By day's end, they'd all carried pan after pan of warm water over to the site and dumped it on the axe head, which turned out to still have its haft, too, bound in leather. By the time they stopped for dinner, they'd melted enough ice to chip the weapon out of its glacial grave, so they could place it and the not inconsiderable amount of ice, still encrusting it into a tray, where it might melt overnight in the warmth of the mess tent. Sybil barely tasted her dinner. She couldn't keep her eyes off her axe, though she knew it wasn't really hers. But she had found it, and it was from the right period, and it definitely wasn't something used in hunting. Not something that ornate. She scraped the bottom of the bowl, only to discover she'd eaten it all. Time to wash up then. But when Sybil picked up the sponge, Lara shook her head. You called that find? You're not doing the washing up tonight. Sybil could only laugh. I did not predict that we'd find a ceremonial axe today. No, you said Thor's hammer. And that's no axe? Sybil's eyes followed Lara's gaze to the tray where the find lay in a pool of water. Sure enough, the ice had sheared away from the axe head, which was bigger and heavier than she'd first thought. And while it was shaped like an axe, where an axe might have a blade was too thick and blunt, more like a hammer or a mace. Oh my God, you really found Thor's hammer? Duran exclaimed, hugging Sybil from behind. Sybil couldn't respond. She could only stand there stiffly and stare. 9. Sybil's mind spun with plans. First, they'd need to completely melt the ice off the weapon and catalogue the find in detail, with more photographs. Then, they'd need to get it to one of the university labs and do some scans. X-ray and CT scans for a start. The metal was shinier than she'd expect for a 1,000-year-old Viking weapon, which were mostly iron. She'd have expected such a weapon to be more rusty than this was, which meant she'd have to find a way to analyze the metal. The handle looked like leather wrapped around wood, and identifying the species might require DNA analysis, which she'd never had to do before, so she'd need to look up relevant papers. So, what's the plan for tomorrow? Lara asked. Finish the transects, or see if there's anything else buried beneath the ice where Sybil found Thor's hammer? Sybil's whirling mind stopped dead. There might be more than just the hammer, she blurted out. Nick made a derisive sound. You are still expecting your Australian actor man? Foolish girl. If such a weapon were buried as grave goods, the body will be little more than a skeleton now. Not to mention it's solid ice. All that work likely for nothing more than a few bones? I say we continue the transects, and see if we can find something of importance. Carl eyed Nick. For a moment, Sybil wondered if Carl was actually going to tell Nick off for being such an asshole. If the hammer is part of someone's grave goods, it's likely there'll be far more than bones in there with him. A warrior who carried such a weapon would definitely be rich and important. The hammer might just be the start, Carl said. Of course Carl would see the research possibilities above all else, even Nick being a complete dick to everyone else on the team. But even Sybil couldn't be upset at the possibility of finding more. A warrior's grave would be an amazing find, and more than enough to write one if not several research papers on. Besides, if a battle really had occurred here, then he wouldn't be the only warrior who died, and there would be other graves. Maybe this was what she'd come here to find. Carl continued, so we should probably mark that site for further investigation later in the season, when the ice has melted some more. What's the weather forecast for tomorrow? Lara tugged the satellite phone out of its cradle and frowned at it. A long moment passed before she said, well, that answers that. Early snowfall forecast for tomorrow, with more snow and freezing temperatures for the rest of the week. That ice won't be melting anytime soon. When the weather clears, we'd be better off returning to transects. Sybil's hopes soared, then plummeted. She was on the cusp of discovering the site of Utgard, only to be stopped by a bloody snowstorm. That'd never happen in Australia, or at least not at any of the sites she'd worked at. Well, there had been cyclone alerts at Burrup, but bad storms could happen anywhere, and you usually had enough warning that a storm was coming to put in a few extra hours a day while the good weather lasted, then protect the site as best you could before you had to evacuate, as the bad weather came in. It was sort of a standard joke among the Burrup team, that there was always time for one more dive. Surely there was time to go out to look at the site after dinner, just in case they'd missed something. Carl rose. All right, time for an early night, everyone. It's been a busy week, and I couldn't be more pleased at how much we've surveyed so far. With bad weather moving in overnight, everyone's to stay in camp until Lara gives us the all clear. It couldn't come at a better time. Jacob's due to arrive with another load of supplies in a day or two, so I want all our finds properly documented, so we can send everything back to the lab with him. Everything done by the end of the day tomorrow, people. He headed out. Sybil's feet carried her after him, almost of their own volition. Are you sure we shouldn't take one last look at the hammer site before it's covered by snowfall? She asked. I mean, we melted a lot of ice, but we were more focused on getting the hammer out than seeing if there was anything else with it. What if? Carl shook his head. The temperature's already dropping. Any ice we melted will have frozen already, preserving any finds for us until it's warmer, later in the season. Don't worry. Whatever's there has waited 1,000 years to be found. Another few months won't make much difference. If she'd waited 1,000 years to be found, she'd be pissed about being made to wait even longer. But he held up his hand. I want to find out what's in there as much as you do. Maybe even more, because if it really is a grave, this could be the ice mummy we've been hoping for. But that's even more reason to wait until the ice melts on its own, because the lower the temperature, the less damage there'll be to the body, before we can dig it out and transport it to the lab for analysis. Helicopters can't fly in bad weather, and even if it could, there'd be nowhere safe to land it until later in the season. But it doesn't matter what's in there, or what the flying conditions are. We filed a risk management plan with the university to allow this expedition, and our safety procedures don't allow survey work outside the camp after dark or during a snowstorm. Besides, I know I need to get my documentation complete. Is all of yours done? Sybil felt her cheeks redden. Well, no. Mostly because Nick had driven her out of the mess tent with accusations of incompetence and bad handwriting so many times, that she'd been waiting for a chance to do it when he wasn't around. Problem was, he'd always been around, so she hadn't had a chance. She probably should have tried to do it in the tent she shared with Duran instead, but Duran always seemed to have something fun to talk about, or to drink, or both, and after a couple of shots of aquavit, Sybil knew better than to try to write anything legible. Good. See that you get plenty of rest tonight, and take care of paperwork tomorrow. It helps to develop good fieldwork practice early on, so that by the time you're my age and leading expeditions, it's just automatic. One less thing to worry about when you're making a dozen decisions a minute, and everyone defers to you. He nodded to her, wished her good night, and headed off to his tent. Sybil stared after him, half annoyed and half gratified, or at least she thought that's what it was. For all Nick's insults, Carl seemed to think she had what it took for a lifelong career in archaeology, up to and including leading expeditions in the future. God, she wished she could talk to her cousins right now. Okay, Callie would probably offer to curse someone, even if only Nick actually deserved it, and Octavia could probably offer half a dozen solutions of questionable legality, depending on who she'd been doing IT support for lately, and none of that would be particularly helpful. It was Tacy she really wanted to talk to, because Tacy had always been the mama bear of Bell House, with the right advice at any time, no matter what the problem was. So, what would Tacy say? Sybil took a deep breath and blew it out. Tacy would say that Carl was right and Nick was wrong. If she just focused on the project in front of her and did her best work on that, the future would take care of itself, and she didn't need to worry about that right now. But the project in front of her was Thor's hammer, or whoever's hammer it was, and the site where they'd found it, which wasn't actually that far outside their camp boundaries. Besides, it wasn't even full dark yet. The days were getting longer, and the sun had only just set. There was still plenty of light in the sky. If she wandered over to the site now and just had a quick look before the meltwater froze over, then she'd know for sure if there was anything else to be found. Anything still under the ice could stay there, but if they'd missed something while they were extracting the hammer, she'd never forgive herself if it got damaged between now and later in the season. Nobody knew safety procedures better than she did, a product of mostly working at sites sponsored by mining companies back in Western Australia. She'd done so many Take 5 checks before starting work, she could probably get a job as a safety officer on a mine site back home, if archaeology wouldn't pay the bills. Then again, the best way to pay the bills was to find something to write plenty of papers on, to show the world she really did deserve the Harold Medal, and more besides. She'd just be taking a walk to help her think, Sybil told herself. If Carl caught her, she'd just say she'd been lost in thought, and not realized she'd walked outside the camp boundaries on her way back from the bathroom tent. Now she wished she'd kept her boots on, instead of changing into her camp slippers for dinner. If she detoured via her tent, she might have time to swap shoes. Not if she wanted to use the remaining daylight. Sybil nodded. Yes, she was sure now. Tacy would tell her to do her best work on what was in front of her. Which meant one last check of the hammer site, just to make sure. Without looking back, she marched off into the sunset. 10. Help. Thor, help me. Thor reached for his hammer before his eyes were even fully open. That call. That voice. He had to help her. He'd sworn to serve, and serve he would. Just needed hammer. He would fight to defend her with his last breath. No matter what the cost, or who the foe was. Maybe even the Wolfman. Just needed his hammer. Thor reached for it, where he knew it would be. Where it should be. Only to grasp at empty air. 11. Sybil swore as they stubbed her toe for the third time. Even with a head torch in the dusky light, it was hard to see where she was going, and every rock looked the same. She really should have stopped to grab her boots. But now she was here, she might as well take a look at the hammer site. Just one problem, finding it in the dark. Even leaning on the cairn, which she was almost certain was the right one, she wasn't sure which way she'd been facing when she found the hammer. It'd help if she could see the outlines of the mountains around her, but it was way too dark for that now, and her headlamp beam definitely didn't go that far. If only all the bloody rocks didn't look the same. Well, they hadn't earlier, but the sun had been out then, whereas now. She had a crazy thought. Tried to dismiss it, but it wouldn't go away. Well, if nothing else worked. Everyone else had called the weapon Thor's hammer. The Vikings had believed in him, invoked him at every turn and wore amulets with his hammer on them. If anyone could help her. Thor. If you even exist, I could really use your help right now. Help finding the place where I found what everyone's calling your hammer. Oh, this was stupid. The Norse gods didn't exist. They never had. Help. Thor, please help me. Something moved behind her, like a stone kicked loose by a clumsy foot, clattering against its fellows until it found a new place to settle. Sybil spun around, lighting up the area with the beam of her torch. Nothing. No one. Except, wait, was that something moving? Sybil crept closer. At first glance, she thought it was a huntsman spider, a really big one, like they got back home. Big and pale and scary, they could be as big as your hand, but weren't actually dangerous, unless you were a bug. Or maybe a small bird or lizard. Only, that didn't look like a spider. It didn't move like one, and it didn't have enough legs. It almost looked like... Sybil jumped back. That was a human hand, feeling around the rocks like it was looking for something. A hand sticking up out of the rocks-like thing, from the Addams family. Not possible. Hands didn't come out of graves in real life. Only in zombie movies. Sybil refused to watch zombie movies, because she was pretty sure they mostly ended the same way, with people being chased and killed and eaten. Nope. No way was she doing zombies. She backed away slowly, hoping the hand wouldn't hear her and come after her. Or that the hand's owner wouldn't, if zombies could. She almost burst out laughing. Zombies didn't exist. This had to be a prank, a joke, a battery-operated toy that someone had put here to scare her. All she had to do was lean in, pick it up, and turn it off. She took a step forward, then another. There was a slight dip in the ground level here, like the hand was in the spot where they'd found the hammer. Well, that would make sense if someone wanted to prank her. Sybil stepped down, then marched forward, determined to grab the thing so she could confront the prankster and... She'd forgotten about the ice. The layer of ice that had stopped her digging any further, that was so slick under her slippers, she couldn't help but slip, unable to stop herself, as she flew forward toward the cairn. Help, was her last desperate thought before her head connected with the cairn and darkness claimed her. 12. Help. The call came again, more urgent than before. Thor knew he needed his hammer. Weaponless, he'd be no match for the wolf, but the call was so insistent, he could not bear to make her wait any longer. He rose, sliding through ice and rock as effortlessly as if it was air. Only to discover he'd arrived too late. The lady he'd been summoned to protect lay lifeless on the rocks. No, wait, she still drew breath. Yes, her heart still beat, for blood leaked sluggishly from a cut somewhere beneath her hair. I am here to protect you, mistress, as I promised, he said, lifting her in his arms. Even though he called her mistress, knowing it was her voice that had summoned him to her side to assist her, he'd never seen this woman before in his life. Her small stature, her dark hair, surely he'd remember such things, even without a face as lovely as hers, clearly illuminated by the glowing diadem she wore. He'd never seen anything like that, either. Crowns were fashioned in silver or gold with gemstones, or so he'd heard. One that glowed like a star with only light but no heat, was wondrous. Magical even. The only other time he'd heard of a star coming to Earth had been when his father told the tale of how his hammer had been forged from the metal of that fallen star. But the dying star his father had caught was nothing to this glimmering miracle. His mistress must be a powerful witch to possess such magic. But she was not dressed for snow, she did not even wear a cloak. She must not be far from camp. Thor scanned the area. Sure enough, he could see the lights and hulking shadows of a temporary camp further down the hill, beside the lake. All the tents were occupied but one that held 2 pallets, presumably for his mistress and her servant. In the absence of the servant, Thor was all she had, so he tore a strip of linen from his shirt and used it to bandage her head, so that the blood would not stain her pillow. For a long moment he watched her sleep, wishing he dared to wake her. Then he heard the crunch of footsteps outside the tent. Ah, this must be her servant. A tall blonde girl of an age with his mistress, but more like his own people than this little witch. Thor knew neither woman would want him present while the servant prepared her mistress for bed, and slipped out of the tent, waiting until the servant was inside before placing himself outside the entrance to stand guard. None shall harm you while you sleep, mistress. I am your protector as promised, he said, hoping she heard him. And there he remained, ever watchful. 13. Strong arms lifted her up, so warm she could feel the heat of him even through her snow gear as he cradled her against his chest. She heard the rumble of his voice as he said something to her that she didn't quite catch. She could only make out one word, protector. It was enough to make her smile. She was definitely dreaming now. She shouldn't have been reading romance novels before bed, because when they inspired dreams like this one, she didn't want to wake up, even when she knew it was a dream. Sybil. Sybil. Sybil clenched her eyes shut against the bright light Duran was shining right on her face. Unless your name is Thor and you have more muscles than a Hemsworth, all the better to carry me away to your castle in the sky. Go away. Duran, being her usual insouciant self, just laughed. You can go back to dreaming about hot Vikings as soon as you tell me where and how you got that. Got what? Sybil grumbled, sitting up. That had been a mistake. Her hangover should have been gone, but now her head throbbed worse than this morning. And that? Duran said, pointing at Sybil's hurting head. Duran. Sybil began. I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, first, that epic wool blanket that I've never seen before, which you couldn't possibly have carried in your backpack here. And then there's the blood-stained bandage wrapped around your head. Even if you have been fighting Vikings in your dreams, it still doesn't explain that. One hand went to her head, while the other stretched out to stroke the blanket. Which wasn't a blanket at all, but a cloak, for it tapered at the top, where it was attached to some sort of hood. It looked like something a hardcore reenactor would wear at one of the medieval fairs back home. Or a Viking warrior 1,000 years ago, her traitorous mind whispered. Duran tugged at the bandage and dropped it in Sybil's lap. I suppose you're going to tell me that's not your blood, but someone else's. Sybil winced as she touched the part of her head that hurt most. Dark clotted blood clung to her fingers. No, I think it's mine. I slipped and hit my head earlier when I went to the bathroom, she lied. She did remember hitting her head. She just didn't remember getting back to her tent. Unless she hadn't dreamed being carried. And I suppose Thor himself materialized, carried you back here, and gave you his cloak as a souvenir so you'd know he was real? Duran asked, almost as if she could read Sybil's mind. I don't remember, Sybil said honestly. Because a dream was just that, a dream. There couldn't possibly have been a real Viking protector, who'd carried her all the way back from the cairn to her tent. How had he even known it was her tent? This had to be a prank. Whoever had planted the Addams family hand had brought her back here, and covered her in the cloak, which had come here in one of the pack horse's panniers. There was no other possible explanation. Sybil climbed out of bed. She was still wearing her winter coat. Not even when she was drunk, had she ever gone to bed wearing that. Someone else had definitely put her to bed, and she was going to raise hell when she found out who. It couldn't be Nick, who must have been born without a sense of humor, and Lara and Carl were too busy managing and leading the expedition, respectively, to have time for pranking anyone. It must be one of the other expeditioners, she didn't know. Well, she knew their names were Lars, Andreas and Frederick, but she didn't know one from the other. They all looked so alike. Just because they were tall and blonde didn't mean they had the right to manhandle her, especially when she was unconscious. If she ever found out who'd done this, she was going to ask Callie for a curse to make all his golden hair fall out. Whoever he was probably standing outside, pissing himself laughing. Well, she was done being some idiot's laughingstock. Sybil bundled the cloak up in her arms. I'm going to the bathroom, she announced with as much dignity as she could muster. Don't hit your head again then. Or I'll have to get Nick to help me carry you back here. I definitely couldn't do it myself, Jaran said. Which definitely ruled out Jaran as the prankster. It had to be one of the men. But which one? Luckily, Sybil had lived long enough with Callie and Octavia to hold her own against a man much bigger than she was. She might not possess all of Callie's or Octavia's unique skills, but they didn't know that. Sybil stepped out of the tent. "Whoever owns this cloak, show yourself right now or I'll burn it to ash," she announced, in a voice she was happy to hear didn't tremble at all. 14. Thor could not disobey a direct order, issued with such authority. He dropped to one knee before her. "You appeared cold, mistress, and you had no cloak of your own, so I covered you with mine. I realize it is not fine enough for a lady like yourself, but it was all I had, and I am sworn to protect you in all things, even from something as mundane as the cold air." He could feel her stare boring into the top of his head. Did he dare look up? If she intended to strike him down, it was better to see the blow coming than to wait for it in ignorance. Then at least he might look upon her face in all its beauty, and— "You can't be real. You can't be," she said, dropping the cloak on the stones at his feet. "I assure you, mistress, I am Thor, your sworn protector, and both I and all I possess are at your service." He sucked in a breath. "Please, wear my cloak to keep you warm, until I can provide you with one that is far finer and more fitting for your station." "I don't need a cloak. I need—" An eternity he waited, or so it felt, but still she did not tell him what she wished for. Finally she said, "You can't be Thor. You don't have a hammer." Thor hung his head. Of course she'd noticed. No wonder she had no commands for him. Without a weapon, he was hardly any protector at all. "I seem to have mislaid it," he admitted. Not entirely the truth, but he did not dare tell her that Jarl Erik and his pet wolf had taken his hammer from him. He could have sworn that Astrid had returned it to him, but that must have been a dream, for it was nowhere to be found now. "I will find a suitable weapon before sunset on the morrow, so that I might better protect you." She huffed out an impatient breath, as if this did not meet with her satisfaction either. "I will protect you, mistress. I swear it from now until my last breath," he said. "If you could persuade the other witch to return my hammer, I would use it solely in your service." 15. Thor. The other witch. A cloak, and now a hammer? Whoever this man was, he definitely wasn't Andreas or Lars or Frederick. That's what the other guy's name was. She'd definitely have noticed if any of the other expeditioners had muscles like this guy, even if they didn't usually go around bare-armed like he was now. Which was crazy, as it had be below freezing outside right now. Even the man's shirt hung open, so she could see his bare chest and abs, and fuck, he was hot. Sybil shook her head, which hurt, so she stopped. This guy couldn't be real. He had to be a hallucination, a product of her head injury and Lara's comments about Thor's hammer earlier, combined with too much reading and her own wild imagination. A sensible person would ignore the Norse god kneeling at her feet, go to the bathroom tent, and then go back to bed, and forget any of this had happened. If she hadn't imagined at all, in which case she should definitely forget about it. But Sybil had never really been that sensible. That's what had brought her halfway around the world to this alien snowscape, the complete opposite of home. So if she really was hallucinating a Norse god kneeling at her feet, then she was damn well going to see if her imagination would stretch to showing her the Norse god in all his glory, holding his hammer, before she came to her senses. Octavia would have told her to go for it, if only so she could ask for all the details later. Alethea would tell her that even if he was a hallucination, she had to help him, because it was the right thing to do. And she had found Thor's hammer today, hadn't she? She definitely hadn't imagined that. Sybil took a deep breath. Keeping her voice low, barely above a whisper, so no one else would hear her, she said, "Come with me. I might have a suitable weapon for you." Then she forced herself to walk toward the mess tent, home to the dripping hammer, that would hopefully yield enough information for her entire PhD thesis. Her headlamp beam cut a clear path through the frosty air. Part of her mind told her she should be afraid, walking out here alone in the pitch darkness. She'd been warned about all sorts of creatures, including bears. Real live bears, that were found in the Jotunheimen National Park, but the clear crunch of Thor's footsteps behind her was so reassuring she didn't fear anything right now. Which was stupid, because even if she thought she could hear his footsteps, he wasn't really there, let alone capable of defending her against a bear or whatever else might be out there in the darkness. Sybil shook her head at her own silliness as she unzipped the door to the mess tent. She swept the beam of her headlamp around the dark interior, wondering what she'd say or do if someone was still up. Not that anyone else would be able to see Thor, so it wouldn't have mattered, but... Wordlessly, she held the door open so he could duck inside. The space felt so much smaller with him inside. Maybe it was partly because he was so bloody big, twice as wide as she was, even without the cloak now draped from his shoulders, and tall enough that his head brushed the ceiling. Then again, it would take a man this big to heft that hammer by himself. None of the expeditioners had been able to lift it alone, though the weight of the ice still encrusting it hadn't helped. It was strangely silent in the tent. Just the sound of her rapid breath, nothing from Thor, without even the steady drip of the ice melting from the hammer that had punctuated the meal prep this evening. Which meant all the ice was gone, and she'd be the first to see the hammer in all its naked glory. She glanced behind her. Actually, she'd like to see Thor wielding his hammer, with both of them all naked and glorious, but her imagination refused to cooperate. The pants and boots and cloak stayed firmly where they were, and while his shirt still hung open, giving her plenty of dye for abs to ogle, he had no bare skin below the waist. It was the hammer she should be looking at, she scolded herself. The very real hammer that definitely did exist, as opposed to the sexy man who most certainly did not. She stepped up to the table, where they'd left the tray with the melting hammer inside, propped up on a bunch of rocks, so it wasn't sitting in a puddle of its own meltwater. She closed her eyes. This was what she'd come here for. An artifact that could make her entire career, and she'd been lucky enough to be the one who found it. Here it is. Thor's hammer, she breathed, opening her eyes. Only to see nothing but a tray of wet rocks, sitting in a puddle of water. What the actual fuck? 16. She muttered many words Thor did not understand, interspersed with ones he did. Something about how someone must have catalogued the artifact before storing it properly, and she'd ask about it in the morning. She also said fuck a lot, a word he thought he understood, but she did not appear the slightest bit interested in engaging in such an activity, so he decided to ask her about it later, when she did not appear so angry. What he did gather was that there was a weapon she'd had in mind for him to wield, and it was not where she expected it to be. No matter. While he would gladly accept whatever magical weapon she might provide, there were others buried in the ice that might serve. He would spend the day searching, and when night fell on the morrow, he would be properly armed to defend her. She stormed back to her own tent, and Thor chose wisely to stay outside. An angry witch could curse him in ways he could not even imagine, and he would be a poor protector indeed if he provoked her ire so much that she turned him into a worm or a toad or some other lowly creature. He waited until both she and her servant were asleep, before daring to venture away from her tent, in search of a weapon. There had to be something buried in the ice he might use. Thor had not taken 3 steps from the camp, before he spotted a shadow moving down near the lake. There was something familiar about the way it moved. In an instant he was running along the lake shore, tackling the shadow to the ground. "You stole my hammer. I know it was you. Return it at once." Loki struggled beneath him, but he could not throw Thor off. "I haven't touched your hammer. That thing's too big to be of use to anyone. Why you don't use an axe like a normal warrior?" Thor shoved Loki deeper into the sand. "That was my father's weapon, made from a dying star. I've killed more men with it in a day than you have in your entire life. Just because you are too weak to lift it, tell me where you have hidden it, so we can both protect our new mistress together as brothers in arms once more." Loki turned his head and spat on the ground. "I would rather die than serve that witch. I'm no traitor. I only wish I had taken your hammer, so that I might use it to knock some sense into you. We are Odin's men, not Eric's, no matter what spell that witch cast. You shouldn't be protecting her, you should be killing her, along with Eric and all his men. No. Our mistress is not Eric's daughter, but a different witch. One far more powerful. She had a crown with a living star that glows. We must protect her," Thor insisted. "You sound like a fool. You do mean the girl who slipped on the ice, without the wit to wear proper boots or even a cloak against the cold? Whatever she's done to make you think she has power, you're wrong. It's a trick, I tell you, and the sooner you see through it, the sooner you will be free of her influence, as I am. You don't see me carrying her about the place, or standing outside in the cold outside her tent?" Of course Loki had seen everything. He was their sneakiest scout, creeping about unseen. How he'd managed to miss Eric's men lying in wait for them on the plain below the pass, Thor still couldn't fathom. But this argument wasn't about the past, but the present. And protecting the witch. "If you seek to harm her, I will not allow it. Though you are my brother in arms and the closest thing I have to a blood brother, I will cut you down where you stand before you can lay a hand on her," Thor warned him. Loki sighed loudly. "Fine. You are under the witch's spell. You'll feel like even more of a fool when I find out how to break it. You always did have a soft spot for pretty women. Teaching your sister to fight was the most foolish thing you ever did, until today. Sif is now feasting in Valhalla, the best any warrior could hope for. Say one more word about Sif and it will be the last thing you ever say," Thor growled. Loki rolled his eyes. "So now your sister is a better warrior than both of us put together. Happy now?" Put like that, Thor could not help but laugh. "You might be right. She would be pleased to hear you say that." Grudgingly, he released his grip on Loki. Loki clambered to his feet, shook out his cloak and dusted off his tunic. "So, what are you going to do now?" "You're going to help me search for a suitable weapon that I can use until I find my hammer again. Once I have that, I'm going to go back to watching over the witch as I swore I would," Thor said smugly. "Then you may do as you wish. I can promise you I won't be serving some strange woman, no matter how pretty she is," Loki muttered. Thor could only laugh. One day, Loki might meet a woman who would make him want to change all his ways. Until then, he could complain about them all he wanted. It was only a matter of time. 17. When Sybil awoke the next morning, she had a pounding headache, and blood on her pillow to tell her last night definitely hadn't been a dream. Well, except for Thor, that is, who was nowhere to be seen. Nor was Jarun, who'd already made her bed and headed out for the day. Sybil struggled into a fresh set of thermals and her outer gear, before heading out to join the rest of the team. "Is it true?" Lara greeted her as Sybil entered the mess tent. That she'd had a hallucination so hot, she'd even dreamed about him? No way was Sybil admitting to that. They'd all think she was crazy. "Is what true?" Sybil asked wearily, heading straight for the coffee pot. She needed 2 cups, before she'd be good for anything today. "That you tripped and fell on the way to the bathroom last night, hit your head and don't remember how you got back to your tent," Duran said. She stared studiously at the ground. "I told them. I was worried about you. Especially when I couldn't wake you up this morning." Maybe hitting her head explained the hallucinations too. "Well, just one hallucination. His Norse hotness." Sybil sighed. "Yes. I think there's blood in my hair, and I'd give my eyeteeth for a proper shower right now." Carl bustled in. "Well, with a possible concussion, safety procedures say you might just get that shower sooner than you think. When Jacob arrives with the pack horses tomorrow, you'll be headed back to civilization with him, and you're not to come back until you get the all clear from a doctor. Safety first." Sybil put down her coffee cup. "I can't just leave. This is my PhD project. I have to keep working. We need to revisit the site where we found the hammer, and see what else might be there. As I told you last night, with snow forecast for this morning and a cold snap forecast after that, it won't be practical to investigate that site for some months, until more of the ice has melted. Plenty of time for you to go back to town, get checked out and return." Carl shook his head. "You're not allowed back at work until I see a doctor's certificate, declaring you fit for work." Duran poured herself a cup of coffee. "I don't know what you're complaining about. A couple days off, then a nice horse ride over the mountains back to town, where you'll have a hot shower, heating and a real bed, plus the whole lab facility to yourself, alone with Thor's hammer, where you'll be able to run every test you can think of. If the news crews get a hold of the story, you might even hit the news in Australia. That hammer is a significant find all on its own, and the news cameras will lap it up, it's so shiny and all." Sybil's eyes darted to the tray, where the hammer had been last night. It was still gone. "Wait, the hammer's going back to town too?" Lara nodded. "Nick did all the paperwork and packed it up for you last night. He must really like you to have done all that. All our finds to date are being sent back to the lab for safekeeping. One of the perks of having a regular supply run. The donkeys come here with full packs, but there's plenty of space to take whatever we need back to town with them. This is better for everyone." Sybil was torn. On the one hand, she wanted to be here, where she just knew there was more to find. On the other hand, if she could just X-ray the hammer, and use the internet connection in town to research what other non-destructive testing she could do on it, plus get something to stop her head from feeling like she'd been on the biggest bender ever, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. "Can you pick up some chocolate while you're in town? I'm nearly out and there's no way I'll make it through the rest of the season without chocolate," Duran wheedled. An entire archaeological dig, without chocolate? Even Sybil didn't want to imagine that. "Sure. I guess I'll have nothing better to do while I'm there," she said. She should probably pick up some more chocolate for herself, too, while she was at it. 18. Whatever the witch Astrid had done to him, Thor could no longer tolerate sunlight, so it was with great reluctance that Thor was forced to take refuge in the icy rocks beneath her tent, instead of standing tall outside of it. That didn't mean his watch had ended. No, the spell the witch had cast had banished his need for sleep and even sustenance, allowing him to remain on guard for as long as his new mistress needed him. She no longer wore her glowing star crown in daylight, and even when the snow started to fall, she did not wear a cloak. Instead, she fastened a sort of short hooded tunic around her, and pulled the hood up to cover her hair. Thor longed to offer her his own heavy cloak again, but he didn't dare venture into the sunlight. At least he had the reassurance of knowing she was not cold, despite her strange choice of dress. He paid little attention to the sturdy donkeys when they arrived or as they were unloaded, but when they made preparations to depart, and his mistress climbed upon the back of one, Thor could focus on nothing else. She was leaving? What did she expect him to do, with her gone? He slipped through ice and rock, until he lay directly beneath his mistress's mount. "What are your orders, mistress?" he whispered, so none but she could hear him. Her and the skittish creature she sat upon, as the donkey shied and danced about, threatening to unseat her. She was so busy trying to stay on the donkey's back, she did not reply, and Thor was forced to watch, helpless to assist her, as she calmed the creature. Thor couldn't help but admire her skill. He preferred goats to horses. It took far more to spook a goat, and a spooked goat was more likely to headbutt whatever had startled it, instead of bolting. He dared not speak to her again while her mount was near, which gave him his answer. He must watch over her as closely as he dared, which meant following her to her destination as best he could. Luckily, the ground was frozen for miles in every direction, a mix of ice and rock that permitted him to slide through it like a hot knife through butter. He would follow the witch and hope that by journey's end, he had earned her trust enough to learn her name. But first, he needed to find a weapon, in case he needed to defend her. Oh, but the donkeys were leaving. No matter. He would find something along the way, he was sure of it. There were more secrets hidden under the ice than even he knew, even with the curious abilities the curse had granted him. But was it truly a curse, if it placed him under the command of such an enchanting witch? There were worse mistresses and masters he could be serving right now. The donkeys moved and Thor followed. 19. The higher they rose in altitude, the sharper the wind became, knifing through Sybil's outer layers and all the way through to the other side. Maybe if she dismounted and walked beside the horse, she'd have been warmer, but Carl had given her strict orders to take it easy, just in case, and he'd made sure Jacob, the owner of the pack horses, would remind her if she forgot. So she stayed on the animal, feeling like an ever-increasing lump of ice, until Jacob called a halt for the night. "We'll camp here. I have a spare tent in this bag for you," Jacob said, pulling out a pair of swags from the pannier of the horse in front of Sybil's. She dismounted clumsily, and probably would have dropped the swag if she hadn't tangled her numb fingers in the drawstring closure of the swag's outer covering. Luckily, the swag was pretty much the same as the ones she'd used on expeditions back home, so it didn't need much thought to set up. When it was done, it was basically a big canvas sarcophagus, long and wide and tall enough for a human body wrapped in a big sleeping bag to lie down in, and not much else. The problem was, it was almost exactly like the ones at home, and while those were fine for a winter's night in the Australian desert, they did bugger all against an icy wind sent straight from the North Pole. After half an hour in her sleeping bag, when her shivering had grown so bad, she was scared she'd bite through her own tongue. Her teeth were chattering so hard, she began to wonder if it was safe to go to sleep at all. That was how people died of hypothermia, wasn't it? They went to sleep and just didn't wake up. What she'd give for the little Everest-rated dome tent she shared with Jarun back at camp. Or even just Jarun, because having a roommate would have helped immeasurably. She thought of last night's hallucination. Having his Norse hotness in her tent, or even in her sleeping bag right now, for real, would be even better. Something crunched on the rocks outside her tent. A bear. A wolverine? One of the reindeer Jarun kept talking about? Maybe it was just Jacob or one of the horses, doing their business before going to bed. Except, she could feel the presence out there. It wasn't going away, even if it was standing still. "Go away," she hissed. Whatever it was shifted, but still it didn't leave. "But you summoned me, mistress. Do you no longer need my help?" That was Thor, all right, or at least the voice she'd imagined belonged to the dream, Thor she'd conjured up. This was crazy, Sybil knew, but so was freezing to death. She'd try anything once. She unzipped her tent. "Quick, come in here and warm me up," she said, before her courage failed her. 20. Thor hesitated. His mistress wasn't the first woman to invite him into her bed, nor the second or the third, but surely he was supposed to be protecting her, not seducing her. Yet if that was what she wanted, he'd willingly bed her. Every night, if that was her desire. "Come on, it's freezing and you're letting the cold air in," she snapped. Thor hurried to obey, sliding into the low tent beside her, as her shaking fingers worked at the fastenings to close the entrance again. He wrapped his hand around hers to help her, only to find her hands were as cold as the snow outside. "Let me do that, mistress," he begged, tugging at the fastening as he'd seen her do. By some magic, the tent sealed itself as his hand passed over it. "SSS Sybil," she said. "My name is Sybil. Stop calling me mistress. You're my hallucination and I summoned you, and I want you to use my name." Thor ducked his head, for he could not kneel in obeisance in the close confines of her tent. "Yes, Miss Sybil." Now he was this close to her, he could not help but notice how violently her body shivered. "You should have kept my cloak, Miss Sybil, and worn it while you were riding. Now you are too cold, and I fear for your life if we do not get you warmed up." "That's what you're here for," she managed to say through chattering teeth. Yes. He was her protector. The cold air could kill as surely as any blade, as he well knew. He should have protected her better on the journey. He should have found something better for her bed than the thin silks she currently shivered beneath. She needed furs or at least fine wool. The best he could offer her was his cloak, so he unfastened it and spread it over her. Better, but still not enough. Her sleeping silks had a fastening similar to the one at the entrance to the tent. Thor hooked a finger through the loop and dragged it downward, so the silks parted at the seam. Inside, she wore underthings that were not much thicker than the silks. Underthings that covered her body even as they clung to it, leaving little to the imagination. He wanted to stare, to drink in her beauty, but he did not dare. Not yet. Instead, he climbed inside the silks beside her, and tugged the magical fastener back into place. "What are you doing? There isn't room for two of us in my sleeping bag," she protested. Sadly, she was right. No amount of magic would stretch the fabric around his broad shoulders, but it didn't need to, as long as he put his body between hers and the cold. Now to warm her in earnest. Thor took a deep breath, leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. 21. The sensible part of Sybil's head said there was no way his Norse hotness would fit in her sleeping bag, but as he crowded in beside her, she had to admit that maybe it was possible. He was her hallucination after all, and if she was going to freeze to death tonight, then spending her final moments pressed up against the hard body of a man who'd make even a Hemsworth green with envy seemed like a pretty good way to go. So when his surprisingly warm lips touched hers, she surrendered to what had to be a dream. Because no real human man could possibly kiss like that. Gentle at first but insistent as her lips molded to, then moved with his. He tasted of glacier ice and ozone every bit the Norse god of thunder, but the scent of wood smoke clung to him too, as though he'd just stepped out of a Viking longhouse to appear 1,000 years into the future in her bed, cold as it was. Not so cold now. One huge hand cupped her cheek as the other stroked her hair, his burning touch igniting fire trails deep within her. Down and down and down his hands stroked, coaxing life back into her numb fingers as his hands engulfed hers. With every stroke of his hands, he awoke more of her, riding out the pins and needles that turned to painful tingles, before she was almost purring like a cat. And just like any self-satisfied cat, she wanted more. Her thermal shirt rode up a little, baring her tummy to his touch. The sear of his skin against hers felt almost electric. She wouldn't have been surprised to see a shower of sparks in the darkness. If he'd only slide his hand up a little further and cup her breast. But he had other ideas, his fingers questing lower. "Yes, Thor, please," she breathed, hardly daring to hope. But he was her hallucination, wasn't he? Hot, calloused fingers crept beneath her waistband, unerringly seeking her aching core. His first stroke across her clit set all her nerve endings alight. Yes. He'd taken her from numbing cold to feeling everything, trembling from the sheer sensation of his hands on her, and she wanted more. She reached for his belt, determined to free him as her first orgasm hit. More powerful than any lightning strike, he left her stunned, barely able to breathe or even see, even as she felt a second one building. The second swept her away, leaving her gasping, hot on the heels of an impossible third one, bigger and better than anything she'd ever felt before. Before. She came to, half sobbing, with her face pressed against his rock-hard chest. She wasn't sure whether to beg for more, or if her body would explode if he touched her again. "Sleep, Sybil, my sweet mistress. I shall keep you warm until dawn, with my cloak wrapped around us both. I will protect you for as long as you desire," he whispered, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Always and forever," she thought, but didn't say, as she drifted into blissful sleep. 22. Sybil packed her swag up, with ruthless efficiency in the morning. Thor, with his magic hands and warm cloak, had disappeared before the first rays of dawn filtered through the fabric of her tent, and Jacob wasn't acting any differently, so he likely hadn't heard her and Thor last night. Well, just her, really, seeing as he was a figment of her overactive imagination. When meant what had happened could only be called masturbation, she told herself. Something any healthy woman did in the absence of a suitable partner, to help her. And if that partner was her imaginary friend. God, she needed to get her head checked out. Good thing she was headed for civilization. If she'd imagined a night like last night while sharing a tent with Jarun, she wouldn't have known where to look this morning. Not to mention Jarun would likely have teased her mercilessly, before asking for details about her hot dream guy. "How long until we reach town?" Sybil asked Jacob, as he strapped her swag back onto a packhorse. "If the worst of the weather has blown over and the snow stays on the other side of the mountains, we should have you back at the university labs before sundown," Jacob said. Sybil breathed a sigh of relief. "So we won't be freezing our butts off in tents again tonight?" Jacob frowned. "If you were cold, you should have said something. I have extra blankets in one of the saddlebags." Now he told her. "I was fine," she said. He nodded. "There's enough hot water for one more cup of coffee, if you want it before we go." Even if she was crazy, she wasn't silly enough to turn down a hot drink, so Sybil downed her coffee, while Jacob finished loading the horses. Today her head wasn't anywhere near as painful as yesterday, and she even managed to dismount and walk some of the way beside her horse, as the narrow track widened enough to allow it. They'd left the bone-chilling wind on the other side of the mountain, so the final leg back to the lab seemed almost balmy, compared to yesterday. Sybil began to wonder if she'd dreamed the cold, too. When they arrived at the university's converted warehouse that doubled as both laboratory and accommodation facilities, Sybil helped Jacob carry the boxes of artifacts into the lab. It was too early in the season for the lab manager to be in residence, She spent most of the academic year at the main university campus, and only came up here later in the summer, Lara had said, so Sybil would be the sole university staff member here. That meant not having to share any of the lab equipment, plus having her pick of the rooms, instead of being stuck in the overflow bunk room like she had when she'd first arrived. Food wouldn't be a problem either, Lara had told her. The cafeteria had a massive walk-in fridge and freezer, full of frozen meals in case the team had to evacuate because of bad weather. Duran had teased her that she'd better get used to eating pickled herring, just like the Vikings, because that's what most of the supplies were. But a quick peek in the freezer told Sybil that while the fridge might have a plentiful supply of fish, the freezer had a much wider selection. Sybil had her eye on a frozen pizza, if she could work out how to turn the oven on in the adjoining ultra-modern kitchen. Maybe she should have worked a few more shifts in Tacy's cafe back home, then she'd know how to use all that equipment. Then again, Tacy's oven had been bought from a decommissioned bakery, and it showed, while this thing wouldn't have looked out of place on the International Space Station. I'll just finish unloading, and then I'll take the donkeys home. They've earned a stay in the stable. I'll call you when we head back up the mountain so you can return with us, Jacob said. Reluctantly, Sybil put the pizza back in the freezer. I should help with that. She followed Jacob outside to where he was already leading the horses. No, wait, he'd said they were donkeys, to an outbuilding on the edge of the compound. He undid the straps on a plastic barrel and carefully carried it into the shed. What's in those, and why aren't they going into the lab with everything else? Sybil asked. These are the refuse capsules, and you don't want them in your nice, clean laboratory. When we have a full truckload, I call the waste facility to come and pick them up. You'll want them well away from the main building, in case any of them leaks. Sybil stared at the barrels Jacob was rapidly lining up along the wall. And by refuse you mean? Any waste from the expedition. You're camping in a national park, and the rules are that you must carry all waste out with you. Food scraps and packaging from the kitchen, empty bottles plus the tanks from the bathroom. Sybil backed away. Which ones are the toilet tanks? Not that she wanted to get near any of them, but... Jacob laughed. The heavy ones that I'm handling with the most care. Don't worry. They froze solid before I loaded them, and they're still mostly frozen. It's not until we get some really warm weather, and it all starts to melt, that you might have a problem. Or I will, for you'll be back in the camp, digging up history, before you know it. She sure hoped so. Anyway, I won't take any more of your time. See you in a week or two, when I'm due to do another supply run. Call me if you need anything, he said. She waved goodbye and headed back inside. Pizza was calling, followed by Thor's hammer. 23. Sybil set her laptop up on a table in the cafeteria, and was deep in a journal database search for suitable tests to perform on medieval weapons, when the timer for the pizza went off. Most of the non-destructive testing involved X-ray imaging of some sort or another, though for some of the more detailed tests, she'd need specialist equipment only found in a large hospital or industrial testing facility. Something to ask Carl or the laboratory manager about when they were all in the lab together again, Sybil decided. She'd also managed to book a doctor's appointment at the local medical center, but as the earliest they'd had available was still several days away, she didn't need to worry about that yet. She reached for another slice of pizza, only to realize she'd polished off the whole plate. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a whole pizza. Back home, she'd always had a few slices left over for breakfast the next day. Unless Octavia found them first, while working through the night on some super-secret project, which was what she was likely to be doing at this very moment, while the other residents of Bell House slept. Sybil should probably get some sleep, too. Shower, then sleep. This has to be the biggest hall I have ever seen. I've heard tales of kings, far in the west, who have such huge halls, but never had I seen one with my own eyes until today. Which king rules here? For the first time, she got a good look at his Norse hotness, and had to admit, he was even hotter than she remembered. Long blonde hair hung to his shoulders, over which was draped the cloak he'd laid over her last night. Right before he'd used nothing more than his fingers to give her the 3 best orgasms of her life. In the light of her headlamp, she'd thought the cloak was black, but the wool was in fact a deep blue, trimmed with cream fur. His shirt hung open, baring his sculpted chest and abs, which ended in a sort of short kilt in the same blue, fastened around his narrow waist with a thick leather belt that looked like something a wrestler had worn. Leather boots covered his well-muscled calves almost to the knee. And in his hand he held a thick staff, topped by— Is that a poleaxe? It was taller than she was, and more of a medieval weapon than a Viking one. Where did you get that? He shrugged his massive shoulders. I found it under the ice. It had a frozen skull spiked to the top of it, which I had to shake off before cleaning it, for I did not think you would want your protector standing beside you with a blood-stained axe. It seemed a suitable weapon, until I find my hammer. The handle is unusually long, a bit unwieldy, so I thought I might cut it down to a better size, if you could provide me with a suitable axe. He looked expectantly at her. Hallucination or not, no way was she going to stand by and allow him to destroy valuable artifacts. A poleaxe is a perfectly adequate weapon for any fighter. There are plenty of manuals that have survived from medieval times, explaining polearm fighting techniques. In fact, I remember watching an online video not long ago. She typed in a search on her laptop, and 2 videos popped up at the top of the first page. She started to turn her laptop around to show him, then remembered he was only a hallucination, and shook her head. What you're going to do is put that back where you found it, along with the skull and whatever else was with it, and I'll show you where your hammer is, okay? Very well, Miss Sybil. Then he just stood there, looking expectant. Well, she had intended to take a look at the artifacts after dinner. Now was as good a time as any. So she rose, leaving her laptop and dirty dishes behind, and headed to the lab.